there's a very interesting thing that we dip the maror into charoset, and the Gemara presents a discussion about what the symbolism of the charoset is. It's not really a mitzvah in the Torah. It's not really obvious why we have it. And the Gemara presents two views. The first view says that the maror, the charoset, is supposed to remind us of the cement that the Jews worked with in Mitzrayim when they were working as slaves. And if you think about that for a minute, you think about dipping the maror, which represents the bitter slavery, into charoset, which is a symbol of the cement. We're basically, doubling the symbolism. You have the maror in the maror, the bitter times in the bitter memory of the cement, and essentially the charoset amplifies the same theme as the bitterness of the maror itself, or it compounds it, or it amplifies what the maror is. It's completely consistent with what we'd expect from the maror. The second opinion in the Gemara says that the charoset is zeicher l'tapuach, which alludes to the midrash, which says that the women who would give birth in Mitzrayim would go out into the fields and hide under the apple trees, and they would give birth quietly. They would be silent. Of course, is an extraordinary feat. They would be in total silence when they would give birth, so that the Egyptians wouldn't know that they were having a baby, and they would be able to potentially save the lives of their children. And of course, this reflects a double act of commitment, because first of all, they had children to begin with, even though they were in such a difficult situation. And then they dedicated themselves to go beyond what would be expected, to do their best to ensure the survival of their children. And to commemorate this act of heroism, we dip the maror into the charoset, which is made from apples, to remind us of the apple trees that we know about from Mitzrayim. And if you think about the symbolism from this perspective, it's really different. It's not amplifying or projecting more of the same maror, but actually it's adding an aspect, a wrinkle or a counter maybe to the maror. The maror is the bitter slavery, and the charoset is something a little sweet that takes away the bitterness. It's something a little bit positive that was in the midst of the negativity. Maybe we'll say it's the silver lining in the negativity of the slavery, the positivity of what these extraordinary Jews did in that time. And in our time also, a lot of people are speaking about the silver lining, the positive and the negative, the good that we find within the bad. But I would like to challenge that formulation a bit, that it's not like saying Gam Zula Tova, that even though it seems bad, it's really good because look at the good that came out of it. It's not exactly what it's saying. The slavery was bad. We don't say the slavery was good because we had the opportunity to give birth under the trees. What we're really saying is this. What we're saying is that it's precisely in the midst of the most difficult times and the most difficult experiences where the true greatness has the opportunity to manifest itself. And it was in that moment when we were able to demonstrate what we're really made of and how extraordinary the Jewish people really is. And by doing the act of heroism in that moment, it really allows our greatness to shine forth. And it's really always like that, that it's always in the most difficult of circumstances where true greatness really has the opportunity to come into focus. And in that way, I think that we should try to think about the experience that we're having as one where not to look for why it's really good, but to look at where greatness can really come out and how we could find the strength to do even greater things than we thought capable or we ever considered or contemplated in this moment. And just the mere fact that we're distancing ourselves is the ability to save lives in such a simple way without having to be a doctor or an EMT or an ambulance driver. We have the opportunity, each and every one of us, to save lives. And I don't know if this is true, but I read some data today that Teaneck actually, after we started distancing ourselves, which was before the rest of New Jersey, we've actually had the slowest rate of growth in all of Bergen County, which hopefully reflects the fact that we're really doing good things. But it's not just that, it's the moments where we can help each other and stand by each other and help people in ways that we never knew we could or they needed. These are the moments where we have the opportunity to develop strength and express strengths of ourselves we didn't know, and not only towards the outside, but also in our own homes as we have the opportunity to really intensify our time together with our families to become great in ourselves in ways we didn't know possible before. On a second note, there's another very blatant tension that we see on Pesach, and that is between, in a couple of ways, between the idea of remembering Zechira, as in Zechira Yetziat Mitzrayim, and the idea of Sipor Yetziat Mitzrayim, telling the story of Mitzrayim. And on a technical level, we know the difference that every day of the year we have a mitzvah to do Zechira, to remember it by mentioning it once in a davening in the morning and at night, which we do in Shema. And Sipor, to tell the story, which is the mitzvah of the night of the Seder, to tell it as a story in great detail, like a story normally is. Similarly, we have another interesting tension, which is between the first days of Pesach and the last days of Pesach. And this is really dramatic, in that the first days of Pesach, we are so focused on remembering the Exodus, leaving Mitzrayim, and the Makot and the plagues, and how God took us out of Mitzrayim. And we allude to the splitting of the sea in the Seder, but it's not the focal point. And the Rambam actually thinks it shouldn't be mentioned at all. And the day that you would expect to focus on the splitting of the sea is the last day of Pesach, which is actually the anniversary of Kriyas Yamsuf. During Chol HaMoed, we traveled from Mitzrayim to the Yamsuf, and we crossed the Yamsuf on the last day of Pesach, and therefore we read Az Yashir when we were in Shul on the last day of Pesach, because it's the day of Kriyas Yamsuf. But yet, there's no mitzvah to remember the story of Yamsuf. There's no mitzvah to tell the story. So we have actually sort of like level one is Zechira, to mention and remember. Level two is Sipor, to tell the story. And level three, which is leaving Kriyas Yamsuf, which is not even to do anything. And I think that there's a specific meaning in all of these layers. And that is that layer one is Zechira, to just remember the past. Sipor, when we tell it as a story on the first night of Pesach, we all know that one of the rules of a story is that a story always has a lesson at the end. A story is not just remember a fact or an event that occurred, but a Sipor is when you frame it in a story, there's a beginning, middle, and an end, and there's a takeaway, and there's a lesson. And that's the Sipor that we strive for on the night of the Haggadah. And that's why the end of the story is Hallel, because the end of the story is the moral of the story. What's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is God did this, and therefore we have this immense feeling of gratitude towards God that we want to express in the Hallel. There's a goal, there's a moral to the story. And when it comes to Kriyas Yamsuf, I would like to suggest that the reason why there's no mitzvah to state this, that God split the sea, and there's no mitzvah to tell the story, is because we saw it's sort of beyond the story. Not only do we not talk about what happened, we don't even talk about what happened with the moral, we just live the moral of the story. We just live the moral of the story. And the moral of the story is Vayaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe Avdo, that we left Kriyat Yamsuf and we became so intensely close to God and so perfect in our faith that we don't tell the story, we just do that. We have the moral of the story without having even the story itself. And that's really what we look to take away from the holiday of Pesach, to not only remember our past, to remember what's the implication of our past, what's the lesson that it teaches us, and then to actually just live the lesson without having to tell the story from beginning to end each and every time. And I think in a way, Yizkor is the same way. Yizkor is to remember the past, to remember people who are so important to us, who are no longer here. It's to remember the past. But it's not just supposed to stop at a Yizkor. It's supposed to be a sipor where it's as a story, and then there's a moral of the story, and we remember not only their lives, but their legacies, and we articulate what is the legacy, and we try to pass it on generation to generation. What's the legacy of the past? And the ultimate goal, perhaps, is like the end of Pesach, where even when you're not telling the story and you're not remembering people, but we're remembering their legacy, and we're just living their legacy, and their descendants see the legacy without even necessarily always pointing to the source of it, because it becomes part of our lives. And I think that this year in particular, the parents and grandparents who we're remembering have a lot to be proud of their descendants, because they've seen a generation have the ability to not only to live the legacy, but to have the ability to switch gears and do what we all know is right, even when it's so different. And may we be successful in doing our mitzvah of the day, which is to save lives. And may we be successful in, God willing, soon resuming to our old lives, and not only to have the ability to continue our religious lives without shul, but to be able to remember how important it is to go to shul and to come back to the shul, but to come back in a different way, to come back in a much more strong way, in a way where we value it more than ever before, and perhaps have more meaning and personal connection in all the things that we do than we did before.